this was also such a clear moral line for people, like they're coming
Yeah.
for children, that there was the trust, but then there was also just the no-brainer aspect of it of like, we're going to sign on. But I think what we learned is that there can be a difference between your really tight-knit coalition where you are like strategically aligned, you are working in lockstep. And then for a campaign like this, which is to say, we are not going to debate the fine nitty gritty of all of our policy priorities to make sure that we are all perfectly aligned. We are going to say, if you believe that all children should be in school and they shouldn't kick out immigrant kids, you
Yeah.
can be a part of this campaign. We are not going to litigate whether every single thing we do is perfectly aligned. Which is, again, you can't do that for everything. Sometimes you have to make sure that you are ideologically aligned in everything. But for a shorter term, very specific campaign, we were able to do that. And we want to lean into that again in the future.
Hey, welcome back to the Campaign Strategist. Today, my guests are Hamp Price and Anika Fassia. Hamp is a strategist and communicator based in Nashville, Tennessee, with a background in immigration policy, civic engagement, and international development. He currently serves as Chief of Staff for the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, where he oversees strategy implementation, supervising the policy, civic engagement, communications, and narrative change teams. Anika is the co-founding, co-executive director of We Make the Future and We Make the Future Action, both of which launched in early 2021 to combine strategic communications and coalition building to implement race-forward narratives that motivate our base and persuade the middle for wins that allow all our communities to thrive. I am so excited to talk to these two today because they were at the center of a huge fight in deep red Tennessee, pushing back on a MAGA initiative to prevent undocumented children from being able to attend public school. And I wanted to talk to them about how did you pull off this kind of victory in this state with all of these forces working against you. And it's an amazing story and one that I think has lessons for all of us as we confront the MAGA agenda and creeping authoritarianism. So I hope you will like, share, and subscribe so that you can keep tuned with the Campaign Strategist. And now let's get to the show. Hamp, Anika, welcome to the Campaign Strategist. I'm excited to speak to you both. Your organizations played critical roles in stopping a bill in the Tennessee legislature that would have allowed public school districts to turn away undocumented children or to charge them tuition for a free education. It struck me as a really important story to share and learn about because you're working in Tennessee. It's a deep red state. You're fighting an issue that is at the top of the MAGA agenda. People all over the country are resisting the Trump regime's efforts to cement authoritarianism, and they're eager for inspiration and proof points that we can take on and stop the MAGA agenda. I just want to hear all about the fight and how this happened and where things go next. But before we get into that, I would love for you each to introduce yourselves, tell me a little bit about how you got into this work and about the organizations that you are with.
I'm Hamp Price, and I am with the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, and I serve as our chief of staff, but most recently was senior director of communications, so have worked a lot in narrative and communications and press work, and been with the organization for about 6 years now, and really came into this work by accident, as sometimes a lot of people do. Really came up through direct services and the type of services that I was doing at that organization in refugee resettlement. Just slowly started seeing where, it wasn't anything about our family's resilience or skills or whatnot that sort of determined whether they were successful, but it was policy, it was bureaucracy, it was systemic racism. And so that sort of is what put me on the trajectory towards the political sphere. I used to be completely apolitical in high school. I never wanted to talk about politics or policy, and yet here I am. So That's a little bit how I got to Turk.
And Turk is the
Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee
got it.
Rights Coalition. It's our acronym
Awesome.
Turk.
Great. Thank you. And thanks for joining us. And Anika, how about you?
I am the co-founding, co-executive director of We Make the Future and We Make the Future Action. And I got here because I grew up as a daughter of Muslim immigrants in rural Michigan. You can only imagine what that might have been like for me, pretty isolating. Nobody else around that looked or, believed in the same faith as us. And I just had a lot of struggles growing up, feeling like the outsider and never really hearing or seeing stories of families like mine. And it was also like an untraditional path. But, after I got into a lot of trouble as a young person, I wanted to do direct service to prevent other young children, from feeling isolated and, maybe using not the most healthy ways to kind of cope. And so worked in like, rehabs for young people and outpatient facilities. And like, similarly noticed that like we can do so many family groups, but like at the systemic level, like how are we centering well-being of people and their families and their economic prosperity that allows them to thrive? And so went to school for policy, was a policy fellow in Lansing, doing, all the policy advocacy and testimony. And again, it was just like people just didn't really feel connected to the work like out in community because it was just a lot of policy jargon. And when I would hold community meetings, I started shifting about how I would engage people by doing like, let's do a visioning exercise about like, if Michigan was a place where everyone felt like they belonged, what would it feel like? What would it look like? What would it smell like? And just doing that shift like really made me like believe the power of narrative and communications to really organize and mobilize people. And then, met with a knot like through narrative work and she really became my mentor. And then worked with her on the race class narrative project alongside Ian Haney Lopez and Heather McGee at Demos, and eventually co-founded We Make the Future to be an institutional home to bring that narrative framework and other narrative frameworks to life through organizing.
Terrific. I'm a huge fan of the race class narrative. We use it all the time, even in environmental stuff, because the fundamental structure of it, articulate the value that really unites people, and then who is it who's trying to take away what that value means to us, and then what you can do. It's a great structural framework that we follow all the time. So thank you for helping develop that. Set the stage for us and tell us what happened earlier this year. Maybe it had its origins before then. What was the bill, where it came from, and sort of how, I guess, the sides were lining up on this in Tennessee when your group started to get involved?
We started our legislative session, which we expected to be heavier on anti-immigrant policies this year, riding the coattails of the inauguration and some of the federal expected changes in immigration. So we were prepared, but being prepared on paper never translates into really understanding how it's going to feel when you have more than 30 really attacking bills aimed at the community. And these bills to attack education, they definitely were a surprise this year. It's not the first time they've come up, though. They did come up in 2018 or 19, I believe. And it was like pretty unilaterally agreed across the aisle that these were far too extreme, that Tennessee would never do this, that it is actually kicking kids out of school would be a terrible idea. And you can see sort of how far we've come or how far we've fallen in the fight for freedoms and our rights, that it came back on the table 6, 7 years later and was, oh yeah, this is something that's probably going to pass. So we had 3 bills introduced, but one that was the most dangerous because it was sponsored by leadership really came out swinging with a press release that said that the whole point was to challenge the Supreme Court precedent that guaranteed public education regardless of citizenship status. And so when those sort of hit the desk, it was a really big wake-up call, because our first initial political calculus was that these bills were going to pass and that was going to be really challenging to mount a strong defense against them.
Was Turk already working with We Make the Future, or was there a point in there where you reached out and said, I think we're going to need some help with this? Or how did both of your organizations start working on it together?
So we've been working with We Make the Future for a few years now. We are big believers in the race class narrative at Turk as well. Our organization, I would say probably mid 2010s, was definitely seen as like the policy expert. You go to Turk for the analysis and you get the deep political thinking. But 10 years later, it's never really how people's brains worked when it comes to changing their mind about something. But 10 years later, it's also just not how we consume information and narratives anymore, right? People are connecting over stories, people are connecting over values. And so we started using the race class narrative, probably around 2020, and have been connected to the Southeastern organizer at We Make the Future for guidance. We've collaborated with them and other organizations on digital campaigns before to align our messaging. It led to one of the strongest, most coordinated digital campaigns that our coalition of organizations in Tennessee has ever run before. And again, since we have multiple organizations sort of tied in to We Make the Future, the fingerprints of race class narrative were on different areas of this campaign from the start. And so one of our partners worked really closely with them as well during the campaign on message guidance. And again, that piece of really moving people to take action by tapping into their values. So yes, we were connected before, and it was natural for us to continue partnering to really drive the narrative that we knew we needed.
All right. And Anika, how did your role or participation in this come about?
Race Class Narrative was originally working with Midwest organizations from 2018 to 2020 before, the beginning of We Make the Future. But because of the success of the work that we had done in Minnesota and across the Midwest, when the blue wall fell in 2016 and then, we regained it in 2020 was, a lot of organizers across the Midwest are connected to organizers in the South, and I live in Texas. And people in the South started seeing what was happening with our partnerships in the Midwest and would be like, hey, I know you don't work in the South, but if you have any time, we would take any support that you can give. And a lot of those groups came from Kentucky, Tennessee, Florida. And so we had been working with the SEIU local, with Justin Wilkins from Forward Tennessee, their comms hub there, for many years. And they were just like, well, just, whatever you can do to support us. And we would always support these groups, even though our focus wasn't in the South at the time. I remember Justin would just text me being like, hey, this is happening. Can you rapid respond on a text over the weekend, some messaging guidance? Because then they would share that out with a lot of coalition members such as Turk. And so there was a lot of this foundational partnership already. And what I really appreciated about organizers in the South is that because they are not battleground states, right? They don't have the resources that other states do in an election cycle. And so their coalitions know that they have to be really strong and aligned and be really savvy with the resources and the political analysis so that they, can break a signal, because they have people on their side, but they may not have resources. And so they saw really early on the importance of being in alignment when it came to how they were communicating across organizations. So we've always really admired the alignment that they have across the coalition in Tennessee.
You're both referring to a coalition. What coalition is that?
We here in Tennessee have some progressive infrastructure through 501c4 table organization, Civic Tennessee, which is a group of 35 different organizations that does nonpartisan civic engagement. And then we also have a 501c4 table as well, Action Tennessee, which coordinates all of the 501c4 organizations that are doing electoral work. And then, like mentioned, Forward Tennessee, and I laughed because I'm very used to a late night Justin Wilkins text with a great idea that I'm left wondering, how am I going to pull this off in the morning? But that is a communications hub that supports all of those groups that are part of the table as well. So for aligned messaging, and on that piece about maybe we have people power, but not always the financial resources, is even things like, okay, we don't all need to be spending the money to talk to the same people. Like, if we're all spending money to talk to one audience, then one, they might be hearing from us too much. And two, we're competing for ad buys, right? When you're thinking of a digital campaign, it's that aligned messaging, the aligned strategy of our theories of change, but then also getting down to the technical of like, we don't need to be both paying Facebook to serve ads to the same people.
So really figuring out the turf of who's responsible for which part and sharing that so that you've got all the bases covered that you need to cover, but with a minimum of repetition and maximizing your efficiency. This leadership group lays out this bill and even explain that one of the end goals is to challenge the Supreme Court decision Plyler versus Doe, which is from 1982. That decision guarantees K through 12 access regardless of whatever the status is that a kid might have. And so their stated goal is
Yes.
this bill, because we want to drive this to the Supreme Court. So what happened next? They roll it out or they announce it? What happens after that?
They rolled it out with a press conference. There's actually a quote from the media of what the House sponsor saying that they think the Supreme Court got it wrong the first time and they like their chances this time around. So it was very strategic. But do want to back up and point out that while the Plyler v. Doe guaranteed that right from 1982 on, it's been the standard, understandable, very reasonable practice for hundreds of years. And it has the attempt to keep non-citizens out of schools goes back to keeping the children of freed slaves out of school to trying to keep indigenous communities out of school. And so we knew while the Supreme Court case was only in 1982 that this is a bedrock of civic institutions in the United States. And so, like I said earlier, when it first dropped, some of us in leadership at Turk were just resigned of this is going to pass and there's not much that we feel like we can do and we should prepare for litigation. We should start finding plaintiffs. We should start training them. We should just focus on litigation. We actually had some of our Turk is a membership organization of individual immigrants and refugees who are members. And it was actually some of our members who told our organizers, we have to fight. We're not going down without standing up for our children. And we're like, great, we're doing it. And so we started with organizing communities, explaining what was happening, explaining why communities would need to get involved, and starting to prepare what it would look like for immigrant and refugee community members from across the state to travel to the Capitol to push back against this. But in the meantime, we recognized that because of the state of immigration in the nation back in the spring, and it really hasn't changed at all yet, that if we made this an immigration issue, we would be getting bogged down in immigration statuses and the complexities of the system and the finances of who is paying for whom. And we knew that that's where we would lose. It wasn't so much that we wanted to stay away from talking about immigration because it was toxic. It was more that it's so complicated and it distracts from the real victims, which is children, and not just immigrant children. Immigrant children in Tennessee would be the first affected, but then it's their friends who no longer have their buddy on the soccer field, whose family has to move because they can no longer go to school here. It's people whose Sunday school classes start to empty out because they are afraid to live in that town. So really recognizing the ripple effects in communities. And then also that, of course, if it went to the Supreme Court, then it threatened public school access for students across the nation. And so we really quickly decided that we had to make this an issue about children. We had to make this an issue about education and just the fundamental value that quite literally most people hold, that every student should be able to sit in a desk at school.
Instead of framing it around immigration or immigrants, how did you set up the core narrative that you advise partners to use?
We are part of a national coalition through the National Immigration Law Center called Education for All, which exists to defend and advance education rights for immigrant children across the nation. So we naturally went with the name for the campaign of Education for All Tennessee and just laid it out very clearly what we were for, not what we were fighting against. And then using both information from them about who tested really well as messengers, and then also leading with those values of every student deserves to sit in classroom, tapping into other values that people learn in school, right? That school is where you learn to be a friend. It's where you learn to take care of each other, right? Like not just the value of education, but like
Yeah.
what you
Yeah.
come out of school with and what those values are. So really leaning into that and then clearly naming the villain in the situation, which was these lawmakers who were threatening to keep kids out of school and then bring people along to the vision of protecting not just students here in Tennessee, but students across the country.
I think I heard it, but how did you adapt, or how does the race class narrative show up in that message? I just think I love hearing about how it's adapted to different uses and different contexts.
I think I also drew back from, Anika, you probably know better than me, but a few years ago, I know some of the pillars of the different messages that y'all are focused on there. One was freedom to learn and adapting it to talk about, tapping into that value of freedom that Tennesseans love down here. But then again, making it about the
Hmm.
learning and less about like the enrollment in a school or like, the nitty gritty of like who's
Yeah.
being kept out. And so really saying that, you know, whether black, white, rich, poor, new to Tennessee or born here, every student deserves the freedom to learn in a safe public school that is fully funded. We also try to tap into other attacks on public education that were happening around the same time. We have school privatization. We've had multiple school shootings with very little action on gun control taken. And so also tapping into the other things that we want for all of our kids when they go to school, not just immigrant kids, but really highlighting that this is one way that our schools are not being taken care of by those who we are expecting to lead.
Yeah, I would love to chime in here,
Absolutely.
Peter, if
Please
that's
do.
okay. What I just really admired about the crew in Tennessee was that the research that Hamp is referencing is that we worked with the National Education Association (NEA) to partner together to test and adapt the race class narrative original findings and specifically around the attacks on public education. We also had to pivot because in the middle of that there was the big anti-CRT things that came up. And I would say it's one of the most highly, utilized research projects that we've ever conducted. And you can see it in a lot of the school board races that, were won on the progressive side throughout the years following. But what Harip was saying was that they were building a bigger we because ultimately, if you look throughout the stealing of this country, the opposition's tactic is the same. It's divide, conquer, distract, right? While they dismantle public systems like education because they are meant to service
Yep.
all people, right? And by dismantling these public systems through these divide and conquer tactics, they can ultimately privatize and therefore pick and choose who has access to them. And by showing solidarity, right, across faith, across race, across status, they were showing that this is, that you're not going to isolate this community and have this just be about immigrant communities. It's about all of us. And so that is how you inoculate against divide and conquer, right? It's not just talking about solidarity, it's actually showing it. And they were showing that, right? Because I think it's very easy for us to use the jargon, we're in solidarity, we're in solidarity. And it's like nobody uses those words, but how do you
Yeah.
actually show it, right? That we're showing up for each other when you can see what that young child, the 10-year-old saying, like, you're attacking my friends, that they did on the floor, that like we're showing up for each other and we're not falling for your tactics.
Exactly. And I think we went with that both on the sort of individual side as to who we were organizing and what communities we were inviting out to really show up in direct action, but also through the campaign side. And there was a huge fear when it first dropped of retaliation for speaking out against this. No chambers of commerce across the state would speak out, even though they knew that they would lose businesses and workers who were like, well, we're not gonna open up shop
Hmm.
here if kids can't go to school. And other nonprofits were worried about political retribution from the state legislature for losing funding. So we really quickly pulled together a steering committee of the NAACP of Tennessee, the Education Trust Tennessee, and statewide organizing for community empowerment that does a lot of public school organizing in rural communities, but then just started inviting any organization who wanted to sign on to the campaign to do so. Before we launched, we made the barrier for entry very low. Just send us your email and your logo, and we will put you on the website. So we were able to launch the campaign with a website featuring more than 30 organizations who had signed on, and it quickly grew to 65, which these were our Black Power building organizations, Moms Demand Action for gun reform, education organizations, civil rights organizations. It really gave each other the political cover to say, like, no, the vast majority of people in this state agree and are coming together, both on the individual side and the sort of organizing of organizations. We were not afraid to be the first to say something in response, but other organizations in that first week or so, we were hearing from a lot of people a lot of hesitancy to sort of be the first non-immigration rights organization to like put their foot out. And so the steering committee of some really strong organizations then encouraged other people to say, like, yes, we will all come together and do this. And so we threw that website together in a week and got all those logos up
Great.
there. So we launched with a really united front around that solidarity, around those values.
I want to highlight the importance of trust and like relationships that you all have in the state because one, I've seen so many organizations and campaigns like not be able to align on a message without doing a bunch of research first, and then it's too late. And you all just like took the freedom to learn research that we tested with NEA. You're like, I know it wasn't tested here, but I know it'll work, and I'm going to try it. Because sometimes you just have to get out there and experiment. And so you all just like went with it, knowing that it wasn't specifically tested in Tennessee, but we know this is the same tactic that's happening everywhere, and we won't know how it really lands until you actually go and say it. So I loved that you all just did it, right? Like we're just so hampered by like, we need the research from like 2 days ago in order to make a move when their tactics have been the same for like 100 years. So like, why do we need, you just have to keep saying the same thing. And then two was that, as you said, like you were able to move so quickly because you have built trust over the years in order to bring people in, right? We are so often fighting each other that it's hard to like move so quickly because, like we are not as aligned and then we're just one organization, all these siloed organizations trying to fight this massive fight. So I just think it's important to lift up the trust and relationships that you all have on the ground to be able to move so quickly and in alignment.
The only thing I was going to add to that is, this was also such a clear moral line for people. Like they're coming
Yeah.
for children. That there was the trust, but then there was also just the no-brainer aspect of it of like, we're going to sign on. But I think what we learned is that there can be a difference between your really tight-knit coalition where you are like strategically aligned, you are working in lockstep. And then for a campaign like this, which is to say, we are not going to debate the fine nitty gritty of all of our policy priorities to make sure that we are all perfectly aligned. We are going to say, if you believe that all children should be in school and they shouldn't kick out immigrant kids, you
Yeah.
can be a part of this campaign. We will give you the messaging. We will give you the social media graphics. We will give you an update on how many people you have driven to take action. We are not going to litigate whether every single thing we do is perfectly aligned, which is, again, you can't do that for everything. Sometimes you have to make sure that you are ideologically aligned in everything. But for a shorter term, very specific campaign, we were able to do that. And we want to lean into that again in the future, not just for the next legislative session, but for other campaigns as well, where it's like clearly we have our ride or dies, but then also we have this broader coalition that says like, yeah, we believe this, so we'll amplify it too.
Anika, one of the things I'm curious about, and partly because it's a podcast about the nuts and bolts, is so you're based in Texas and you're working with and supporting different groups in different states. How much of your time was focused on this campaign? Did you end up traveling back and forth, or was it just a lot of Zoom calls? Did you two talk each day? Sort of how did that work of you being able to funnel helpful resources and information and guidance to the campaign and know what they're dealing with?
Yeah, so we're a completely remote organization, and as Hamp noted, we have staff that support organizations in the South and then in the Midwest. So they have like a point person. But initially when Justin and I texted, we were like a team of three, and so honestly, a lot of it is just like rapid response texting, like this is happening. Like can you link me to the latest guidance? It's getting on a call and being like, these are the three things you need to hone in: the value, the freedom to learn, lift up the villain, and then what is your solution? Because a lot of it, and I think Anna has said this many times, that the opposition does so well is they say fewer things more often. And so honestly, a lot of times when we're in this defensive mode, we don't realize that we don't have to say so many things. We have to just say less things and more often. But I think when you're in your default mode is to get a little bit more complicated. And so a lot of it is just like it's reminding them. It's reminding them to say the same thing, to be disciplined. Sometimes it's like, hey, get on a we're doing a strategy call. I just need you to come in and say this thing to everybody else. Right. And sometimes it's connecting them with other states, because I think they can learn best
Mm-hmm.
from each other. So, right, if somebody recently navigated a similar bill in Kentucky, getting two of the organizers together to talk, to be like, hey, we tried this. Because sometimes it's like, oh, we're doing a lot of experimenting and just trusting that somebody else has tried this. It gives people the faith to just go ahead and try it too. But yeah, we do a lot of things virtually. The only time we really travel is like, hey, we're really needing to ground this entire coalition in this framework. And you come and do a workshop, do some planning so that we're all aligned from the beginning, is most of the time that we're coming in. But we really trust people. Like once you've got it, your community best,
Yeah.
right? So like you're on the ground and we're here in the background if you need us. And then additionally, like we often like raise funds so that we can rapid respond, give them resources financially to do some rapid response communication, whether that's a quick digital ad buy, whether it's to put up a billboard really quick or buy swag, signs that are all saying the message that we agreed on, that we can quickly move the money to them. Or it's connecting them with a vendor, right? Maybe it's like, hey, we've never done a radio ad. Do you have vendors? And we often have already approved, being like, hey, these are
Mm-hmm.
mission aligned vendors. We know they're affordable. We know that they're located like near your region. So they're not somebody who's like, on one part of the state that is not going to know like what it's like to like do messaging in Tennessee. And so those are the
Yeah.
many ways that we can provide resources as kind of like a background hub.
Thank you. And you mentioned villain a couple times, and I wanted to ask, so how did you name who the villain was for this fight?
This is one where we actually went pretty specific with our villain for this campaign. Obviously, we know that the attacks on public education are coming from lots of different places. They're coming from private school corporations that are making money off of school vouchers, coming, from when you're thinking of gun control, obviously there's all of the different powers that be there. But for this bill, instead of really trying to tell the bigger story of the attack on public education and really honed in for where we thought we had a chance at killing the bill, which was to really marginalize the sponsors, even though they were in leadership and even though they have a lot of power up at Capitol Hill. They look at each other and they can see when activists are sort of tracking certain members, and it's like, well, I'm going to do whatever I can to not have the activists trying to get on the elevator with me. And so we really leaned into targeting the sponsors, specifically the Senate sponsor of the bill. And I think this is probably where a lot of rapid response conversations and texts came in, because our partners at Forward Tennessee were really instrumental in mobilizing people with clear messages to take direct action in the sponsor's district. So showing up at his church with prayer request flyers to pass out and actually finding his car and putting it under the windshield, right? And like those are people who said, I know XYZ about this target. We want to go do this. And so we really tried to ostracize the sponsor of the bill and to be able to put him on defense. One of the reasons we leaned into values-based messaging was, again, to reframe and to really drown out the sponsor's talking points of like fiscal
Yeah.
responsibility when those arguments had no teeth. So we just kept hammering both digitally, on the ground through activations in the press, that this was an attack on children's education. We slowly start to see the press framing around it switch. The press was asking the sponsor questions based on our framing rather than asking for explanations about the finances, right? The headlines were about kicking kids
Hmm.
out of school, not about the tuition that would be charged to immigrant kids, right? Because the bill charged tuition, which we know is a way to effectively kick them out. So, right, we kept the frame and put the targets on defense, made them explain themselves over and over again, while we talked about what we were for instead of just talking about why we were against their bill. And then after, as the campaign reached and we sort of expanded and held a national day of action, we did bring in some of those other voices of the other attacks on public education and some of the other villains that are a part of that. But for the most part, during the campaign, really leaning into, we have a unique opportunity where we have very clear villains and the potential to very clearly move
I love
them.
that. Was there a particular point at which you could detect in the legislators, the leaders you were naming, that they were starting to feel like this is harder than I thought it would be, where you could just tell from them and their behavior and conduct and what they said that you were gaining an edge, you were getting an upper hand?
Yeah, I think that what actually let us know that we were building power and having the effect is that the vote count started getting narrower and narrower. It was passing by one vote in committee, by a couple of votes on the House floor. When Tennessee has a supermajority, like, it should have been flying through, but instead it started slowing and the vote counts were close because we knew we might be unlikely to change the sponsor's mind. But again, if we could still
Mm-hmm.
marginalize them as extreme and give them trouble, then their colleagues would be like, I now feel like
Yeah.
I can vote
Yeah.
against this because they're being painted as the enemy. Um, and so it really was sort of those peel off votes from people that we expected to vote for it, one of which, just as an aside, is a very devout evangelical. And we, very last minute, had a pastor come up to his office to lay hands on him and pray for him that he would do the right thing for the kids and their freedom to learn. And that was one of our craziest no votes that
I
we
love it. I
got
love it.
as it started peeling people off. And then it started slowing down. And then towards the end of session, at a point where it should have been being really pushed through because things were wrapping up, it slowly started to disappear for the session. So I wish there was one like grand moment, but it was sort of just more of like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, are
Yeah.
we doing this? Like, is this working? Which was really energizing for our team, most of whom like didn't sleep
I
for two
bet.
months.
Did you also like develop a target list of the legislators that you thought you could move and encourage people to engage in similar tactics aimed at them, or slightly more polite tactics? But how did you also apply pressure on them to go with the denigration of the sponsors and making them somebody that other legislators wouldn't want to associate themselves with?
Yes, our legislative team identified the lawmakers on different committees who were either had the potential to vote no or to abstain from voting. And we actually worked with partners to stand up phone systems to call voters in those districts and then have those
Mm-hmm.
voters call their lawmaker, recognizing that the base that was most easy for us to mobilize is in Nashville, Memphis, Chattanooga, Knoxville, some of the larger cities where the lawmakers were already against this. we knew we needed to mobilize people in more rural districts to contact their lawmakers. Tennessee is a very long state. You can drive from Tennessee to Canada faster than you can drive across the state of Tennessee.
Wow.
So there's no way that we can be in all 95 counties organizing as one organization. And so we had phone banks. We did 16 phone banks in 2 months, I think, to call voters in district and have them call their lawmakers. And so really we brought in over 5,000 new supporters during the campaign who either volunteered, took a digital action, called their lawmaker over the course of the 2.5
That's
months.
great. So you had multiple layers of engagement and activism that you were asking people to do. Did you have local media plans and organizing like different kinds of constituent voices to do lawmaker meetings and so on? Was that all organized like through the coalition?
Yes, we had especially faith leaders and small business owners mobilize. This was a really big lesson for me in the I guess I came up through a very traditional communications role where it's like you put out a press release and that is how you get coverage. And I'm like, oh, wait, it's 2025. Working in reverse of how I sort of grew up in this and saying, okay, we're going to put out a petition for faith leaders. And then the people who sign the petition, we're going to reach out and see if they'd be willing to record a video. We're going to post the video, but then the people who post the video, we're going to see if they'll talk to the media or meet with the lawmaker, right? And really use that first petition, which again, going back to the coalition idea, like anyone can sign a petition, but once they do that, then organizing them once they've taken that first step. We here at Turk have been talking about how everything is communications and communications is organizing and organizing is communications. Because even if an organizer says like, I don't do comms, I just meet with people one-on-one, it's like you are communicating. And so really recognizing that these trusted messengers, faith leaders, small business owners, teachers, educators, bringing them in maybe digitally first, and then continuing to find those champions and setting them up with their local media or to call and visit their lawmaker. You know, we're a part-time legislature, so most of them go home on the weekends. So again, trying to set up meetings if they knew them and things like that in their districts.
I'm really curious in like how many of those individual petition signers did make videos. And the reason I'm interested in that is because as I've thought about how the left overall we've got to level up our communications game, a lot of which is about generating more content. And it's more content than any one, well-established group can generate. And also people pay less attention than they used to well-established authoritative groups. And they're much more responsive to content that they associate with because the person looks like them or expresses similar values. There's something they can relate to in their background. And so the idea of trying to enlist people to do more of social content just to get more content up their topic, and of course you can use it in other ways, is really interesting. Were you surprised at how many people did actually make videos, or was it difficult? Like, I'm just curious about that level of response.
Yeah, for us in Tennessee, I don't have numbers or anything, but when we invited people to do videos, I think what we found really striking was we had the most success with people who are very used to public speaking already. So like pastors, they'll churn out a video really quickly because they are used to being in that pulpit. Teachers as well. And then recognizing that we do have to do a little bit more cultivation and training with folks who are maybe not as used to speaking out, to public speaking. But I think what we have found is once we sort of talk with them about how to share a story, obviously we don't do a race class narrative training every time we're like trying to get a pastor to make a video, but to say like, we're not asking you to be a policy expert. We're not asking you to have the numbers that like refute this. You just need to talk about the fact that you're a Tennessean and you don't like this, right? I think that a lot of folks in the past that we have run into, we actually just did a similar training on this, this past week, specifically around like talking to your relatives at Thanksgiving who might not agree with you, of really pulling that veil back of like, you don't need to be a policy expert because that actually doesn't work. If people change their mind because of a fact sheet, I would have changed a lot of minds in my life. But people change their mind because they connect on values and stories. And so I think once we work with people who are like, yeah, I'm interested in doing this, but I've never talked about this on social media before, and really saying that it's a lot less about having the right script and a lot more about sharing the right story. And the right story is the one that you've lived, that you've
Yeah,
experienced. So
absolutely. So we've talked about some of the sort of the outside game. What would the inside game look like?
my advocacy director not sleeping for 2 months, probably. Yeah, our inside game at the legislature was to, again, to really identify the people who were like, I don't like this, but I don't think I can take a stand, and giving them like connecting that to the outside strategy in order to give them the cover to be able to take a stand. Like, I think that's again going back to like there are certain things we're not going to budge on, right? There are certain values and priorities and things that we're not going to budge on. But we didn't need in this case we didn't need a lawmaker to like completely understand the need to like build a compassionate immigration system that's not based on like punitive measures. Like, we just needed people to be like, yeah, I want kids in my district to be able to go to school. So I would
Yeah.
say our inside strategy for this campaign was a lot less on moving people maybe holistically, and a lot more on identifying who is potentially thinking that they could be against this. How do we give them what they need to be able to do that? And also seeing that as like a stepping
Yeah.
stone to
Yeah.
further conversations, right? Seeing that as maybe a seed planted for a further conversation where we talk about other attacks on the immigrant community. But it was really tough because we heard over and over again that we were being too loud, that if we would just cut back on the protests, it would go away or potentially go away. There's a lot of thoughts that sometimes our lawmakers here in Tennessee will do something because they don't want to appear weak. So like they don't want to look
Mm-hmm.
like they gave in to us. But this was something where we just really thought we can't risk being quiet and hope that this will go away. Because also like what would we say to our members at the end of the day, at the end of session when it passed and
Yeah.
they said you didn't do anything to stop this? I'm like, no, we had an inside strategy. We promised. Like we were doing meetings, and it's like, okay, that's not building power. I mean, this was some of our allies too, like not just people who were against us, but allies who were saying, stop doing all these protests. You're being too loud. We thought some relationships were damaged because we said, no, we're going to keep showing up. We're going to keep disrupting and really make it clear how many people are against this. So I think that was like the tension in our inside outside strategy. This time is like, we're going to forsake some of the inside strategy to build longer term power through this narrative that we're telling and through the opportunities to activate people.
Anika, do you see that kind of tension in other campaigns where you're working with groups? And it sounds like in Tennessee they thought it out quite deliberately, weighing the options of quiet down versus stay noisy and maybe make some people upset. What are examples you've seen in other places where people are trying to walk that line and figure out how to balance those kinds of things?
Yeah, there's a particular campaign that's coming to mind, but I'm actually not going to name names. But it was in the Midwest, and it was around, the fight around, like opioids, and like how do we support people either through, more punitive measures or like actually thinking about mental health and well being. And obviously, the fight was very racialized, right? Like these aren't people in your community, that are affecting it. And the progressive side of it was split. Similarly, they're like, part of them were like, just don't say anything. Nobody will even know. Because if you actually, because it was such a, like, not a highly publicized issue, they thought if you actually say a bunch of stuff, you're going to make it more known and actually make the opposition
Mm-hmm.
even fiercer. And so they were like, just don't say anything. And then the other side was just like, no, like we cannot not say anything. And we have to make it about, someone you love, may need this treatment, right? It's not about, like, again, connecting it to the moral high ground, not about like these other people over here, which I think is like, how the crew in Tennessee did it so well. It's like you have to seize the moral high ground. And especially in a time of authoritarianism, people need to see what other people are thinking to know that it's safe to also disagree, right? If like you don't see
Yeah.
anyone disagreeing, you're just gonna be like going about your life and being like, no, well, nobody seems to make a ruckus about it. So like it's not gonna do anything about it. And so I think that's exactly how we allow the other side to take hold, right? And they are very loud. They're actually much smaller in number, but they are very loud, right? And if like the other people are looking around, they're like, well, they're not clearly saying anything, like as Anat has said, like people are often thinking about what sounds the most
Yeah.
familiar,
Yep.
right? And if you have a very small group, but that's very loud and in tune, that's what can be most familiar to you. And you're just going to assume that's what everybody else thinks.
I think that the structure of using the race class narrative allows you to like the values are big picture, right? Like our values are big picture. The villain and what they're actively trying to take away in that moment can be super specific. And then, the vision for what kind of future we
Yeah.
want could be big, right? And so I think it's a great way to really hone in on a very specific villain and a very specific thing they are trying to take away from our communities, but still tapping into those more expansive values and visions so that the next time it's not a whole different story, right? Like, if in the next legislative session they don't bring the education bill back, but instead come after something else, like the values of fairness, the values of opportunity, the values um, of being supported in the place you call home. Those are all things that worked for education, but they will work for something else. And so it's like you can you don't have to forsake the long-term vision, but you can not get bogged down in
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
It's like supporting the action that you're asking someone to take.
Well, and it's also about not getting overly wound up in what the other side is trying to do and how that's part of a bigger thing that's like, and I think we look at that struggle all the time with, do we talk about the things Trump is doing in a specific way, or is it about the authoritarianism? And there's a lot of debate about that. And the right thing to do may vary, almost certainly does vary from case to case. Anika, I'm curious, are there lessons from the Tennessee campaign that you now like are part of sort of how you talk to other groups in other places about the race class narrative and how it works, or and other as example to help them think about how they're approaching their work in a way that's as strategic as possible?
I think that one, as we talked about earlier, we have to be scrappy in the South. What the lesson that I really saw is that like everyone understands their complementary role in the campaign, right? So, for example, last year, I think it was like 4 to 6 groups, including Turk, worked with us to get resources on a GOTV effort in particular districts, all saying the same message, but having different
Mm-hmm.
distribution tactics. It's like, we're going to do the texting, we're going to do the digital ads. And so, like, everyone had their particular layer of a different communications tactic to like contribute to the surround sound, but they were all saying the same thing. Right. And so, when you're in a state with not a lot of resources, you have to be that aligned on like, what is my particular role? And then layer it on top of each other because people receive the same information in different ways. And so, like, you can only make it common sense if it's like being repeated in different ways that people receive information, right? Like, not just on the digital, but like in community with each other, like, or on on a radio ad. They're like, oh, I keep hearing the same story and it's coming from different people, right? It's not just this one organization just to keep saying it. Other organizations are saying it. So that becomes common sense. And I think that what Hamp was saying about how like organizers are communicators, communicators are organizers. Another lesson is so many groups are siloed. It's like the
Yeah.
comms team is over here. They're doing these traditional like press releases that, I mean, I don't know who's reading those anymore, but they're doing that over here. And then you have the organizers, and they're saying completely different things. And I'm like, why are you saying completely different things? And they're not talking to each other. And like, Janae Bates at Isaiah, the co-ED there, has made the term communicanizing, right? It's like, how are we completely integrated in how we communicate, right? And so I think the integration and the layering is the key lesson. And you don't need a bunch of
Yeah.
resources to do that, right? You have to have a shared analysis and strategy, know your particular role, and then you just keep saying the same thing in those particular roles and strategies.
As my mentor was very fond of saying, it's like we're in a church choir. Everybody's got their part to sing. And when you put it all together, it's really
Exactly.
powerful. And
It's harmonious. People
yeah,
want to listen to
yeah,
it, right? Yeah.
And I think what we like, it's also part of like, and if you have a good song, more people
yes,
want to join the
yes,
choir, right? So I think we were able to get people sharing a message that they potentially weren't tapped into earlier, that they might not have even been paying attention to the fact that our state legislature exists,
yep.
right? But then when they heard or saw a digital ad that kids were getting kicked out of school, then they were able to join.
Yeah, and I think what's so powerful about the RCN framework and can be adapted across regions, across issues, is that it's actually grounded in a political analysis about like how we got here and what we can do about it. And it's not just treating issues in isolation. It's an actual like story, right? Of like how we're being pitted against
Yeah.
each other. And we're actually, united, and we have to come together, and we're not going to let this person or that person tell us otherwise. And then this is the vision we can actually all achieve. Instead of just responding to theirs, we're actually inserting a story to explain not only how we got here, but how we can move forward that can be adapted and be, the shared understanding that we're moving people through.
I'm struck in this case, what an incredible example of it is, of the power of the race class narrative, or even if it's a variant of that, leading with the value that we want to espouse, that we believe in, and then naming the people who are in the way of us realizing or experiencing what that value means. Because one, it's far more inspiring to talk about what we're for than what we don't like about what they're trying to do. And Hamp, as you mentioned, it helps to shift that frame so that you end up getting reporters asking about it from your framework instead of continuing to validate the excuse that the sponsors put forward. Where did the bill end up? It's not moving forward. It definitely stalled for this year. Are you expecting it to come back next year? How are you preparing for that, if so?
Two of the bills, because like there were actually three, like I said, two of the bills were completely killed, could be reintroduced in some different way. One passed the House, but the Senate bill had not passed the Senate Finance Committee. And this is where, to that point earlier about seeing the power shift, they sort of had to jump through some hoops to get it to go away without saying we're not going to vote on this. And they did the same thing to another controversial education bill. They said they're going to vote on the budget first because those things have budget implications. Let's pass the budget and then we'll come back to those. And
Yeah.
they just never came back to it before they left session. I think that's another victory in how much pressure we put on, because we were forcing them. At first, they were saying this bill would not hurt Tennessee's finances at all. Like there'd be no implication for our finances. And we were like, what about all of those federal education grants that we're not going to get if you are discriminating very blatantly against children? So they were forced to say, like, maybe there's a few financial implications. So again, even the way that it went away for the year shows the amount of pressure that we put on. When the session comes back in January, the Senate bill will be potentially going to Senate Finance. If it passes there, it will go to the floor. And there are a lot of different theories floating around about what's going to happen, whether it stays away or whether it comes back very quickly and gets tried to ram through. And so we're preparing for all of those scenarios. We have been talking with partners again about how we launch a very wide coordinated message, potentially even tied into other issues as well, because if this bill dies very quickly somehow, like there's still going to be a lot of other bad things. Memphis right now is occupied by federal and state forces,
Right,
right?
right.
We expect there to be things around that. Like there's not going to be a lack of fights to keep pushing forward. And so talking to about how do we use other narratives, other framing to tie in. So for example, that like, do we launch a campaign with the messaging of Tennessee as home? And home means every kid can go to school. Home means you can choose when and how to start a family. Home means that you can afford to pay your rent and buy your groceries and not go bankrupt, right? That all of the things that make up a home are actually all the different issues that our
Hmm.
organization sort of ecosystem all work on. And that way, if education for all doesn't end up being the predominant story of the whole session, like it was last year, that it's tied to this broader fight of like, we protected education for our home. What are the other things we're going to protect?
I'm curious, you didn't mention educators. Did they take a significant role or were they worried about retribution?
We knew from testing from the National Immigration Law Center that bilingual educators, especially, were really powerful messengers in this. So we did mobilize and prepare educators to speak, to testify in committee, to speak at rallies and actions, to speak to the media. But we did have educators who were organizing, supporting their students in organizing their own classroom. So there was a rural school where a school club sort of came together and made sweatshirts for education for all. And the teacher supported them. But I think that teacher did also see backlash from their employer, right? So there was a lot of fear
Hmm.
of doing anything sort of in their official capacity, but we did have people who were willing to speak out and be a part of that message, even if it wasn't maybe like as visible as the sign-on letter of small businesses that,
Yeah.
100 small businesses signed, but they were definitely still involved.
Well, we're just about at time, so I want to pivot to my traditional final question for each of you. But maybe start with Anika. What is a lesson learned or piece of advice that has influenced you and been really important to you throughout your career?
I swear this came before Ezra Klein and his whole thing about abundance. I'm not ripping him off, but like many years ago, my executive coach was really helping me like be in an abundance mindset. One, because, I'm running a startup nonprofit, right? Like we're only almost 5 years old and we're a very particular type of organization. And I think this could apply to just not even your professional life, but your personal life, that if you're in a scarcity mindset, you're often
Mm.
settling, right? Because you think this is the best that you can do, whether that's like on a date, like finding anything, a house, or like finding an employee to hire, and like really shifting my mindset to being like, what is it that I really want? I want to be in a mindset of abundance. It's really helped me not have to, because I think if you think about the way that the messaging on our opposition works so well is that if you get people in a scarcity mindset, they actually hold tight to things that are actually not allowing them to really fully thrive and be their full selves. And that's actually how the opposition can really tap into that. And how is I to think about like what could possibly be? I have to vision that. I have to be in that. You have to manifest that. And when I'm talking with groups, especially in the South, especially in Texas, when we're constantly in defense, people can't think abundantly. They can't think about what could Texas be. And then therefore their communications and their organizing is in that scarcity mindset. And so I really have to push people to be like, hey, it doesn't have to be this way. Like we don't have to respond to every attack. Like how can we just take a breath and think abundantly and like use our time wisely and strategically? And so I just feel like that has been such a good mindset to remind myself in personal and professional
Great.
life.
Thank you.
I think the first thing that popped into my head, which is a funny example, because some might argue that the way it was delivered was actually terrible advice, but clearly it stuck with me. I remember one of my first supervisors when I started in sort of the sphere many moons ago said something sort of offhandedly in a check-in of like, hey, in meetings, like sometimes you just sound too confident and then nobody else wants to like give their idea. So like maybe just check on that. And I was like devastated. Like I said, terrible delivery of that advice, but because I was like, I'm talking over people. I'm like not letting other people speak. Took it really really terribly then. But I think like in the decades since, thinking about it, I think where I see myself a lot is like coaching and developing others and like giving that space to people to learn and to grow. I think, again, like with this whole campaign we've been talking about, was a lot of just like, we're going to do it and figure out like what the takeaway is, right? Like, we don't have to have the right answer up front. And so I think when I think back to what was terrible advice at the time, now it is just a reminder of like, you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to fix the thing the first moment it comes up. Like, we can strategize. We can let people lead, let voices come in that maybe aren't at the first table when the issue comes up, right? And take that breath to grow what we're all doing, which I guess sort of ties into abundance, right? Like achieving more together if we're not just in the mode of solving something with a band-aid really quickly.
Thank you both so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This is great, terrific work. Congratulations. Thanks for tuning into The Campaign Strategist, where we dive into the art and science of advocacy. The podcast is produced by Prismatic Strategies to share wisdom and insights from leaders in the field. I'm your host, Pete Altman. Music was written by Andrea Perry and Pete Altman, and this is edited by Abby Altman. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who care about making a difference. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. Thanks again, and see you next time.